Just saying to Suzi, one of my questions would be, and this obviously goes for yourself as well, I think sections of cannabis and CBD in recent years have come on leaps and bounds. Obviously, the fact that shops are now openly selling CBD across the UK, and CBD seems to be, for all intents and purposes, quite widely accepted in a lot of places now. Do you see the same for something like psychedelics in the future, given their application in medicinal purposes and therapeutical purposes, and the more kind of studies that are coming to light and more legal clinics and trials? Do you see a similar thing?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. I think there's surprisingly more overlap between illicit and medicinal substances than you'd think. So ketamine, for example, is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It's an incredibly useful anesthetic, and it's used in the UK. It's used in human and veterinary medicine, but it is used in human medicine, but it's also an illicit substance, and I don't think that's necessarily sort of realised. And as Danny was saying, heroin is a medicine and it's an illicit substance. So this idea that something can have therapeutic benefit, making it suddenly be sort of okay recreationally, that line is a little bit more blurred. I think the thing that makes the difference is the headlines. As cynical as that sounds, I think getting things in public awareness is what makes difference, because it enables understanding, and it removes this kind of othering line that we see. And I think that's kind of why I think this medicinal cannabis, it's not just CBD in terms of some of these epilepsy treatments. It's medicinal cannabis rather than just CBD, although it does seem like it's the CBD part of it that's the therapeutic part. And I think that the law wouldn't have changed if it hadn't been for the huge media campaign. That's my personal opinion, but it certainly seemed that way. I'd be interested to know what Danny thinks about that as well.
Yeah, I think there's a big issue that sits behind this for me, and it's the issue of what my partner calls deserving and undeserving drug users. And I think it's a real problem, because we think of if it's a medicine, so going back to the pharmacon thing, that drugs are both medicines and poisons. That if it's a medicine and people are using it as a medicine, then they deserve it and they should have it. And it's terrible that these poor people who are in pain, and listen, I've got enormous sympathy for people who could benefit from currently illicit drugs that they can't get hold of, that could benefit them. But we have to understand that the normal way that drugs come onto the market and are put into the hands of clinicians is that they go through a very, very rigorous testing process that starts with animals, and then they move on to human trials, and it takes, for some drugs, decades, but at a minimum years. Now, given the fact that prohibition has been in place for a long time, there's been a real problem, and David Nutt's brilliant on this stuff, that there's been a real problem in terms of being able to do medical research on these things. But that aside, I think there's a bigger issue here about focusing on these things as medicines, whether it's cannabis or psychedelics, that these are magic medicines and they're going to cure everybody of depression and stop your trauma and deal with your cancer. I think particularly around psychedelics, there's a real concern that I have that you can't magic away trauma, and particularly if you have societal conditions that traumatize a lot of people, particularly for people who fight in wars, soldiers. And that's one of the big things. These vets can go and do ayahuasca in an Amazonian jungle and they'll come back all better. The things, well, let's stop fucking them up in the first place by sending them off to be shot at and put themselves in situations that are just deeply, deeply traumatic and horrible usually, and deeply, deeply awful for the countries that they go around invading. So there's a real danger for me of losing the focus here of what this is about. What this is about is these are racist laws that were set up for all kinds of spurious political purposes. And interestingly, actually, some of the original legislation going back in the UK, prohibitionist legislation was put in place in order to stop soldiers taking cocaine, because they thought they wouldn't be able to fight. And I think that if you begin to break this stuff apart, deconstruct it a bit, the idea of throwing psychedelics in as a kind of magic cure-all for everything is just really quite offensive. The issue here is, how do we get policies in place, particularly drug control policies, that meet the needs of citizens and the widest group? Now, you can pick off easy hits. And I think that that's certainly what happened in the US. They went for medical pot, and then recreational pot came along afterwards. But that's because they had this ability to work with citizens in order to push the debate along. That isn't happening in the UK. As Suzi said, whilst we have some access now to legal cannabis, the number of people who get it is there's a handful of people who have access to it. It's incredibly expensive. They're all getting private scripts because most mainstream doctors won't prescribe cannabis because the trials haven't been done, so that the evidence base isn't there for to enable them to do it. And I think particularly that, so just to say again, one of the things that we've seen in the US on the back of the statewide initiatives is the decriminalization of possession now of certain psychedelics in certain states, particularly around California. No surprise there. That we may well see an incremental approach to drugs moving from a prohibited approach to a decriminalized or legalized approach. And it could be that psychedelics come in first. But in terms of looking at this overall, in terms of the massive harms that prohibition causes, psychedelics are pretty much a non-issue. Most people who want to use psychedelics use them. But the issue here is, how do we put in place a comprehensive, scientific, evidence-based drug control policy that meets the needs of the majority? And the majority of people are involved either in the production, supply and use of cannabis, and then the drugs that really cause the major problems in terms of their prohibition are cocaine and heroin. So psychedelics are kind of a relatively marginal issue, about which, in my humble opinion, some of the claims for their efficacy are hyped beyond belief, in order for certain self-serving purposes. And that's not to say that I've used psychedelics. They're incredibly powerful and can be a gateway to a whole other way of seeing the world. But we're talking about public policy here, and that really needs to be seen in the global round.
I would quite like to ask you, Danny, actually, about cannabis legalization, if that's okay, because looking at the US and Uruguay, that when we think about sort of legalization or regulation, it might seem that that's just one thing, but actually there are so many different ways that you can do it. And Uruguay and the US, as far as my understanding goes, have taken very, very different approaches for what legalization means. So Uruguay's quite a sort of pharmacy-based caps on how much THC you can have. You can only buy from certain places, I think possibly even at certain times of the day, I'm not sure. Whereas in the US has obviously gone very much more capitalist. Any product you can conceive of that you can put cannabis in, they'll chuck it in. No limits on how much THC you can have in it. And obviously when you're talking about creating a regulated or legalized cannabis market, in terms of sort of public health and in terms of practicalities, it's quite a fine line to walk, because you've got to make a product that is will reduce the harms that you're trying to reduce, but also you've got to make a product that's appealing enough to the user that they won't just carry on getting their usual stuff because the stuff that they can buy legally is pathetic or doesn't do what they want it to do. So
so you're absolutely right. I haven't got a hell of a lot to add to that. So Uruguay has a very strict state controlled model, So that it's the Uruguayan state that commissions people to grow, and then cannabis is sold from as you say, from pharmacies with caps on THC. And then the US, actually there's quite wide variations between the states and the US. Some are more like the Wild West, very, very commercialized, and very powerful edibles, very high levels of THC. Other places are more strictly controlled. But it's also interesting to compare with Canada, which I think currently doesn't have edibles, and is more strictly controlled. But also, like you say, some of them have just been growing shit weed, and people don't want to buy it, or it's going off too quickly, and so people are sticking with the illicit market. I think that part of this is a trial and error process, but also it's really useful to look and compare the different models. But just coming back to something that I talked about and something that you raised there, the issue is nobody has yet set up a comprehensive public, and this is, I just think, ridiculous that nobody has yet put together a comprehensive set of indicators to assess efficacy across drug control. Now, if you could look at things like levels of psychosis, numbers, first age of use, because you'd want people to be using drugs later rather than earlier. You want young people not to be using cannabis. So first age of use, all the kind of criminality surrounding it, tax take, all kinds of things that you would want to monitor. But there ought to be something that comes out of the WHO, the World Health Organization, that advises governments on how best to put in place their drug control regimes. But we don't even have that for alcohol and tobacco. We've had real trouble putting in place minimum unit pricing on alcohol, which we know reduces harm amongst the heaviest drinkers. So given that we can't do that, it's difficult to see and to recognize governments and states' genuine commitment to keeping levels of drug-related harm at their lowest for the citizenry. And they're still more interested in placating the needs of corporates who are new to this newly legalized money-making world than they are in actually looking after citizens. So, and this is the danger, and why I wanted to show that graphic at the beginning, which is the dangers at both ends of an overly commercialized, effectively deregulated legal trade, and you get almost equivalent, or sometimes worse harms than you would under prohibition. So you really do have to be aiming for this sweet spot in the middle of that spectrum, but you can only do that if you have clear criteria for assessing whether your drug control is effective. And currently there aren't internationally recognized indicators of that, which is just ridiculous.
This is where I think it's not science versus politics. It should be science hand in hand with politics, of sort of designing randomized trials to assess, like when you put in a new policy like this, do it in a way where you can then test what it's doing to the underlying population. And in a way, you can do that in the US because of this state by state differentiation in legalization. There's hopefully going to be some really nice natural experiments looking at, for example, levels of psychosis where they change when different regulations are brought in on the line of a state boundary, where the people are obviously very similar, but they're operating under different laws. Does that affect how many people use, at what age they use, whether they develop any of the problematic things like cannabis dependence or psychosis?
Absolutely, and that really is down to governments, whether that's at state level or national level, whether they're interested in even finding that out. And then it's a question of whether citizens are prepared to push governments in order to assess that. Because it's our kids, our brothers, our mothers, our fathers. It's the ordinary people like us who have to deal with the effects of this stuff. And we're the ones who have to push governments in order to work on our behalf rather than some new bloody cannabisness.
Do any of those numbers or early studies exist yet in the more progressive states in the US? Is there any sort of early? early
There
signs.
are, and like I say, the evidence is that the sky didn't fall in. There was a really interesting editorial actually in the New York Post, which is a proper US tabloid newspaper. It was, I don't know, maybe 6 months, a year into some of the states' legalization moves. And they said that the sky hasn't fallen, neither has it significantly darkened. And it really was a kind of the demonization of legalization is still at such a level that if it isn't as bad, if it doesn't work out anywhere near as badly as the doom mongers and critics suggest it will, then that's probably good enough. At least politically, because obviously you need to keep your media on side whilst you make these moves. But the evidence is that some part of demand is captured. A lot of it isn't, because the supply isn't good enough, or the prices are too high. So a big issue here is pricing. You have to be able to out-compete the illicit market. So as well as people wanting not to break the law, you have to meet their needs financially. And I think that all those kind of things are playing out. Research is being done. And it's unsurprisingly, it's going pretty well, generally. But it's not perfect. Nobody said it was going to be perfect. But geez, it's going a hell of a lot better than prohibition is.
You mentioned earlier, Danny, the Framework Convention in 2003 around tobacco control, sort of limit adverts, limit ads, public health, deal with over-commercialization of tobacco products. Could that kind of happen in reverse for illicit substances, do you think, where they're sort of drip-fed with very minimal advertising, with very kind of, we're not going to over commercialize this at the start, but we're going to sort of put it into the public sphere and see how it goes before we fully kind of commit to this whole kind of capitalist market, or like it is in some states in the US?
Well, it's absolutely. I think that the beauty of shifting from prohibition to legal regulation is that we can learn from policy failure. And operate under what my colleague Steve Rolls at Transform calls the precautionary approach. You start with low levels of lower levels of THC, perhaps higher levels of CBD, no edibles. You could even raise the age, the higher than 18. There are all kinds of things that you can do in order to move from a position of taking greater precautions and then gradually loosening up. And there are enormous opportunities to do that for governments who are willing to engage in experiments with legalization. But they have to be well researched and well evaluated. So yeah, there's massive opportunities here to do that with any drug. But the bottom line is that we know that gifting very large commodity trades to organized criminals and unregulated dealers is not going to present great outcomes anywhere. And we've been focusing mainly on consumption. But if you look at the horror story of what's happened in Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, and then there's all the transit countries through Africa, Afghanistan, the Balkans. I mean, I did a piece of work a good few years ago now, looking at which countries security was compromised in one way or another because of prohibition. And I think I found about 60 out of 180. So a third of UN member states has their security compromised in one way or another because of fighting this stupid war, which because of the amount of money involved, enables organized criminals to accrue vast amounts of money and firepower that enables them to compete for monopoly violence with the state, and that is a real issue. The other thing is that a lot of people who work in security would recognize that. So whilst they're fighting the drug war, they would also recognize that they're kind of fighting themselves, or fighting another bit of government that's done something really dumb in order to undermine security that they then have to sort out. I mean, it's a bloody horror story of, wheels within wheels of awfulness, where the standard narrative is we have to continue doing this because drugs are dangerous. Meanwhile, as I say, nicotine and alcohol, which everybody knows are really, really dangerous, they're not prohibited. They're legally regulated because they're really dangerous. I mean, often very poorly. But think about what would happen if you made nicotine and alcohol illegal globally. You'd just make a hell of a lot more money for the mafia.
I think I've probably got one more question to add, and everyone that's in the room at the virtual room at the moment, please do add questions at the bottom if you have any. There's an ask a question button at the bottom. This is quite an all-encompassing question, and there's probably no straightforward answer to it, or maybe there is. Maybe there is. Do you either of you, maybe starting with Suzi, do you ever see a progressive global shift in terms of drug policy where the focus is more on the science and isn't on the politics? Do you ever see that actually happening? Is that just a pipe dream, or is it something that is within our grasp?
It's a good question.
It sounds like a no.
Well, I mean, never say never, because like politics is doing weird things at the moment. So, when I first started working in this field, which was, I guess, in 2008, 2009, when I started my PhD, I would have said never. But I do feel like since I've been working in this field, things have changed quite a lot, certainly around cannabis globally, and that's got to mean something. I think it's good to see things happening in other places that can then be sort of called on as evidence, because as I think Danny said quite a few times, it's often the politicians just feel like it would be a sort of a vote loser to stand up for these things. I mean, David Cameron was someone who was pretty vocal about drug policy reform until he became a more prominent politician, when suddenly he went very quiet about these things. So, there are people making the right noises, but they're the people who don't have any power to make the changes. And then when they get into power, they stop making the noises. But the evidence doesn't even necessarily support that. So the paper that I was going to mention that I've just published, that I was involved in, about drug consumption rooms in Scotland, we conducted a piece of research where we got a representative sample of the Scottish population and asked them about their opinions towards these drug consumption rooms. So this is places where heroin users can go and use a substance in a sterile environment with sterile equipment. And these exist in lots of countries around the world, and they seem really quite effective at reducing the risk of overdose and death. They also are able to have naloxone present, which is a antagonist that can bring someone out of overdose straight into withdrawal, but save their life. And what we found was that actually the attitudes of the people we sampled, which was a representative sample, were broadly positive towards it. And particularly if you also added information sort of refuting with evidence the opposing arguments or the arguments against drug consumption rooms, presenting scientific evidence and also a sympathetic personal story. So getting away from this othering and sort of highlighting that these are these are people who are experiencing this. These are people that we are sort of forcing into like railway arches and grubby alleyways and that kind. I mean, this sounds really sort of like hyperbole, but the people do have to go to very unhygienic places to use a substance if they're also hiding from the law, as well as sort of hiding from, well, you know, they're being put in these situations. And so it's not a case that this is necessarily a vote loser. If the messages are presented in a sort of empathetic and evidence-based way, people really respond to them and resonate with them. And yet, I don't know if you've seen in the news over the last couple of weeks, Peter Crikent, who's taken matters into his own hands in Glasgow and has got a drug consumption van that he is driving around, which is basically doing a sort of mobile drug consumption unit. He's potentially getting into quite a lot of trouble for doing this, but believes that it's really important. And yeah, so while there is evidence that people are broadly in support of these kind of harm reduction initiatives, or we're able to have a more grown-up conversation about drugs, there's still this barrier that I think is going to be really hard to overcome.
Danny, do you agree?
I think that there's, I saw I watched David Cameron very up close and personal as he went through that process. He was a member of the Home Affairs Committee in 2002, to which I personally gave evidence. So he was sat on the other side of the table with his, 10 other MPs and asked good questions, listened to the evidence. But the other thing to remember in terms of where David Cameron was at, so not only was he a recreational drug user when he was younger, he also had a family member, because there was a press blackout, was always referred to as family member X. I mean, it's not that difficult to work out who it is, who he had gone to pick up on a regular basis from crack houses in West London. So he knew it both from the recreational point of view and as having a family member who was in a right old mess at the time, and was just completely normal about the whole issue, understood it, spoke about it in a very impassioned way about the need for reform. And then I watched him gradually slew off his common sense, science and evidence-based position. And I remember the moment, because we'd been pushing very hard when he was in the leadership race for the leadership of the Tory party, for journalists to push him on his views on drug policy reform. And I remember at one point, Andrew Rawnsley at The Observer basically asked him about his drug use. And suddenly the whole thing got diverted into whether David Cameron had used drugs when he was at Eton. And it was a godsend for him, because he didn't have to talk about what he'd said during his time at the Home Affairs Select Committee in 2002. And it just became a salacious story about whether he'd smoked dope or what drugs he'd used at Eton. And by the time he actually became leader, and I remember it really vividly, because prior to that, I remember being in I don't know what I'd done. Anyway, I got into a room with Tony Blair, public meeting, and I asked him about his views on drug policy reform. And he just fired straight back, "I'm terrified for my children." And I remember when David Cameron was asked about legalization, same phrase, a few years later, "I'm terrified for my kids," because he knew that was the safest thing to say in that situation. So I think that the problem is that given that most politicians and political parties are primarily self-interested and interested in power, maintaining power, and maintaining power relations with other nation states, that because prohibition in its current form serves as a kind of geopolitical glue, It's part of the world order. It's very difficult to see how significant numbers of nation states, and particularly hegemonic states, imagine the Chinese, the Americans, or the Russians saying, "Oh, we've had enough of the war on drugs. We're now going to go and be nice to drug users and make sure we look at this in an evidence science." It just doesn't make any sense between Xi Jinping, Putin, and Johnson and Trump. It just doesn't make any sense. And I don't think Sakir Starmer is overly interested in rocking that boat either. So you're looking at a situation which even within a party political position is difficult to see a way out of. At a geopolitical level, given that this is set up at the UN and primarily serves the most powerful political forces on earth, it's difficult to see within the current setup how it can be fundamentally undone. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't see decriminalization of personal possession, legalization of cannabis, but it's ever so difficult for me to envisage a situation at the United Nations where some combination of Mexico, Argentina, India, Brazil, and a number of European and African states are really pushing to end the drug war globally in order to better serve citizens. It doesn't compute for me, sadly. However, I do see a situation where if we fundamentally shift our politics in favor of citizens, that you could see that change. But within the current setup, I can't see it.
Sorry, feels like a sad note to leave it on. It feels like a very negative note to leave it on.
It isn't, because I think that there's a call on us, and for me, it's because this is a global issue. It sits at the same sort of level that climate change does. I can't imagine a situation where we reach net zero by 2030 under the current political setup and economic setup. It doesn't make sense to me. However, if we fundamentally shift our politics and economics to meet the needs of citizens, then I can see us dealing with climate change. So I'm still positive, but only if you explore it outside of the box rather than within the